Thank you for tuning into the WOLA podcast. I'm Adam Isaacson. As usual, I'm here to remind you that these podcasts are free. They're ad-free. But the Washington office on Latin America, WOLA, is an independent organization. We operate entirely on gifts and donations, so please support our work. The easiest way to do that is visiting wola.org, WOLA.org, and clicking on donate right there at the top. So this episode is part of a few activities that WOLA is planning to carry out to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Operation Condor, the coordinated campaign of state-sponsored terror that U.S.-backed military dictatorships in South America carried out in the 1970s and into the early 1980s of targeted assassinations of political opponents, democracy and human rights activists across borders in each other's territories in a coordinated way. The best known of Operation Condor's attacks was the September 1976 car bomb that went off here in Washington in Sheridan Circle, a short walk away from WOLA's offices, that killed Orlando Letelier, who was Chile's foreign minister in the deposed government of Salvador Allende, and Ronni Karpen Moffitt, who had worked with Letelier at the Institute for Policy Studies. Until September 11, 2001, it was the worst foreign terrorist attack in Washington and perhaps on U.S. soil. But Operation Condor, it started formally in November of 1975. It really got going 50 years ago right now in May of 1976 with some organizational meetings. It killed hundreds of people transnationally. It went on for years. Even though U.S. officials were uncomfortable with it, their efforts to stop it were just shamefully feeble. So for this episode, I'm talking about Operation Condor with Peter Kornbluh. He directs the Cuba and Chile documentation projects at the National Security Archive, an NGO that has done decades of remarkable archival and transparency work, reconstructing the historical memory of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War before and since. Peter has written innumerable articles in major media outlets, several books, including The Pinochet File, a declassified dossier on atrocity and accountability, which he has revised regularly over the years. Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, which he co-authored with Bill Leogrand in 2014. Here in this conversation, Peter points out that the U.S. government was not present at the creation of Operation Condor, although it absolutely helped to create many of the secret police forces that carried it out. In fact, many U.S. officials were concerned about the idea of killings across borders, even as they effectively backed human rights abuses within borders. The story here is nuanced, and the way some accountability was achieved and the way people, including Peter, fought to get information released has a lot of lessons for today now that U.S. agencies and forces are committing human rights abuses and collaborating with abusers in Latin America while we speak once again. Let's listen. Peter Kornbluh, thank you for joining the podcast. It's good to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I have been a longtime fan of WOLA for my entire professional life. In fact, I came to Washington, D.C. from Ann Arbor, Michigan, precisely because I wanted to work for WOLA.
No kidding.
Yeah, I sent a letter.
I'm sorry that didn't work out for you.
It didn't, but other things worked out.
Here we are. When I was in college, when I was in grad school, actually, I never make a deadline. And I was looking for internships the summer between, and I'd already missed WOLA's, so I just didn't get that internship. But I'd missed their deadline. But now, years later, I made it up. But it's good to see you. We've been in the same community for a very long time, but you work on something that and often WOLA has not specifically. And I was reflecting on this and thinking, like, I was born in 1970. Most senior staff at WOLA similar in age. So that means we grew up in the Reagan years, Central America, Iran-Contra, later the drug war. And of course, we knew about how the United States supported coups in the 1950s, the whole Cold War, supported the military dictatorships that came to power in the 1970s when WOLA was founded. But by the time we were adults, the 1988 Chile plebiscite happened when I was 18. There were more or less democratic governments everywhere. And things like Operation Condor were what we learned about in college, but it wasn't like day-to-day activism. My point here is not to say, oh, you're old, because you're not that much older, but you went into the archives and dug things up. And so I should ask you, and I know you've done this a million times, but just for our listeners, what was Operation Condor and just what was that the environment like in the 1970s when you had military dictatorships almost blanketing the map of Latin America?
Operation Condor was a reflection of the true evil of those military dictatorships, particularly the ones in the Southern Cone. Condor was a transnational, multinational, sinister collaboration of the secret police forces in the Southern Cone military regimes working together to share intelligence, track down, locate, spy on, kidnap, and assassinate their opponents, not only their opponents in the Southern Cone, but around the world. It became a global program with reach all the way to Europe and even to Washington, D.C., where the most prominent critic of the Pinochet regime, Orlando Letelier, was assassinated with a car bomb, along with his colleague at the Institute for Policy Studies, Ronni Karpen Moffitt, on September 21st, 1976, the 50th anniversary of which is close to arriving. So that was Operation Condor. It has been widely misunderstood. The number of victims of Condor has been often misconstrued as all the victims of the Southern Cone Repression, but it was a specific targeted program to basically eliminate the opposition to these military regimes. At one point, the Chilean secret police chief, Manuel Contreras, likened it to a Latin American Interpol, but of course it was far more sinister than that.
That actually doesn't sound like much of anything. In terms of scope, this started, I guess, formally on Augusto Pinochet's 68th birthday, November 1975, and it was considered operational until more or less the fall of the Argentine dictatorship in 83, I suppose, or is that accurate?
It depends on. There was no formal closure. There was no ceremonial meeting that said we're retiring all of this. It kind of dwindled away in some ways because of the Letelier assassination and the notoriety and exposure of Condor that heinous act of international terrorism in the streets of the nation's capital of Washington, D.C., brought to all these military regimes. But it was active all the way through till 1980, very active. And then it started to dwindle away. And then there were Condor-like operations all the way through to the early 1990s, where kind of on a more ad hoc basis, the police forces and security forces collaborated on one specific operation. But most of us historians of Operation Condor date it from November 25th, 1975, Pinochet's 60th birthday. Condor was almost a birthday present to Pinochet, arranged by his secret police chieftain, Manuel Contreras, who invited all of the leaders of the Southern Cone secret police services to come to Santiago and sign this new program, a collaborative program. At the very end of the meeting, the delegate from Uruguay rose up to thank his hosts, the Chileans, for bringing them all together to discuss this really very important problem of opposition to the military regimes and how to eliminate it. And he proposed that to honor the hosts, they name this new secret operation after the national bird of Chile, the Andean condor. And that is how Condor got its name.
You've mentioned Augusto Pinochet, who, of course, ruled Chile until 1990. You've got Contreras, his intelligence chief. Who are some of the key personalities we should know here?
The leading personalities were Pinochet and Contreras. This was essentially their brainchild. Contreras was sent out to have preliminary meetings with all the main countries and their intelligence chiefs. Contreras was the person who actually sent out the invitations for that first meeting. And then the second meeting of Operation Condor was also held in Santiago, Chile, just 8 months or so later in late May, early June of 1976. It was at that meeting where the assassination program, which was codenamed Teseo, after the mythological Greek warrior, was founded, and the whole assassination program was created. And so the Chileans were really the central figures. If there's two people most responsible, it was Pinochet and Contreras. We even have declassified CIA records quoting members of Operation Condor saying that the entire motivation for Condor came from Chile and that Contreras consulted with Pinochet for the list of assassination targets that became part of Project Teseo. There were others, of course. The Uruguayan secret police forces and the Argentine secret police forces were the other major players in particularly the Theseus component of Operation Condor. Condor had its specific assassination program, was pretty much limited to those three countries collaborating. The base for the command center for the assassination program was actually in Buenos Aires, not in Santiago, Chile. Condor, as a broader entity, also had a secret communications system. It also had intelligence sharing capacities. It sent data and lists of leftists and tracking and money transfer type information, all coordinating comprehensive, basically regional effort to repress opposition to the military regimes. Some of that opposition were militants who were armed, but often, and these were civilians who were targeted, who had nothing to do with kind of violence at all. They were trying to restore democracy to their countries.
First of all, when you say secret police, I think we should clarify for people. When you say secret police, people think of the Stasi in East Germany.
That's right.
What's another? But my point, or even some people would add ICE to that list. But those are civilian forces. Yet we're in military regimes. I don't know if that distinction really matters, but just to help illustrate for people, were these like subsets of military intelligence? And if so, how did all of these regimes develop these intelligence capabilities to begin with?
Well, the United States government, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically helped all of them, and particularly the case in Chile with the Chilean secret police, which was known as DINA, the Directorate of National Intelligence. Yes, it was an intelligence effort against the left in Chile and elsewhere, Chilean exiles abroad. But, it wasn't just an intelligence gathering effort. It was a effort of repression, torture, disappearance, assassination, you name it. And so in a sense, it was like the Stasi or the intelligence services of Germany. We're talking about true evil repressive forces. And DINA was enough, but all of them acting together was a rather extraordinary phenomena. And in the case of the Chilean secret police, which was created shortly after the September 1973 coup led by Pinochet, Pinochet specifically asked the deputy CIA director, Vernon Walters, face-to-face in a February meeting that was secret for years and years and years, whether the CIA would help the Chilean military regime now create an intelligence service. And he asked that the CIA receive Manuel Contreras, his man. Pinochet said, my man is running DINA in Washington. And Vernon Walters said, of course, we'd be glad to help. That's why I'm here to offer you our discreet assistance on the behalf of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. This was literal. We do have the Vernon Walters report finally on this secret meeting. And it's very noteworthy for Pinochet's personal request that the CIA help organize the Chilean secret police. Contreras was invited to Washington the following month in March. By early summer, July, teams of CIA officers were arriving in Santiago to do training operations, training schools for DINA agents, and to help DINA kind of construct an organizational tech chart, tech system for its kind of overall apparatus. So the contribution was direct. When it came to Operation Condor, which we can talk about, the CIA was less enthusiastic, particularly about the assassination program. But the CIA was tied to the other intelligence services that were part of Operation Condor, and then, for many reasons, became extremely concerned about the blowback on the agency itself once Condor was exposed.
I want to dig deeper into this U.S. role in a moment, especially like what the nature of that training was. Right now, you've got, intelligence, being used to hit people on boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. You've just had 2 CIA agents discovered killed in a car accident in Mexico. There's a lot going on, but I want to ask about that in a minute. But first, before just to exhaust the topic of what Operation Condor looked like, two things come to mind that strike me. One, looking at the documents, it seems like, well, first of all, it was incredibly bureaucratic and banal. They really made it just sort of a state function to carry out these kills and assassinations, which that always strikes me with other dictatorial regimes too, but it was very institutionalized. Even though a lot of these countries had disagreements, I believe Argentina and Chile, for instance, at the time were having border disputes, pretty serious ones, yet they were somehow able to overcome these differences. And then finally, the language that they used often when they were making these lists of people to target, they often called them terrorists or agitators. And only sometimes, I might have this wrong, but it seems like only sometimes did they use words like leftists or communists, although that's what they clearly meant. But that use of the word terrorist, of course, is what is so often used now. So that struck me too, but I might have that wrong.
Well, the internal documents do refer to terrorists, but more often than not, they use the word that you and I both know in Spanish, subversivos, subversives, which could be anybody who opposed the regime structures that had been set up now in Chile and Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay.
You didn't have to be violent.
Yeah. There were, hundreds of victims who were just civilians because they opposed the regimes, but there were militant leftists also operating, particularly in Argentina. But after the coup in Chile, the MIR became far more militant and working from outside of Chile. And so, there obviously were militants, but the military regime saw this as their war, and they were very repressive. But, you're absolutely right. The documents that we've obtained on Condor actually define the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt called it. I mean, these were bureaucratic, programmatic records of how repression and international assassination, which took the form of terrorism, frankly, state-sponsored terrorism, was organized, constructed, and implemented. And we have one extraordinary document on Project Teseo, which was the actual founding document, which laid out the budgets, the monthly dues, the specifics of the assassination missions, who would go on them, how much there'd be for a clothing allowance, how many days they would spend abroad, how they would locate the target, assassinate the target, and escape. And it was all extremely bureaucratic, including that dues for membership in Condor and Teseo would be paid on the first week of every month. They'd be $2,000. A one-time membership fee would be $10,000. I mean, it was rather extraordinary. And when we got this document, which wasn't found until decades later, it came out with the special Argentina declassification that Barack Obama had ordered in 2016 that had eventually been completed by the Trump administration in its first year.
Wow.
When we got the document then, it was the lead document in every piece of media work we did and led the New York Times story on the Argentina documents, and really, I think, showed people the true nature of what the Southern Cone repression and Operation Condor was.
Yeah, just the fact that you could participate in this campaign of international, basically terrorism, and this would be the basis for your job reviews, your promotions, your pension, and much else is something we should lose track of. But let's turn to the U.S. role. As we noted, I mean, we're recording this podcast will probably go up in May, the beginning of May of 2026. So almost exactly 50 years from the Teseo meeting that formally launched the campaign of killing people around the region and around the United States and Europe. So you've talked about this a little. The Nixon and Ford administrations clearly knew that these regimes needed, in their view, a better intelligence capability, probably a very repressive intelligence capability. Before we get into just the founding of Condor itself and what happened during the summer of 1976, I'm more curious about, okay, Contreras or Pinochet talks to the CIA, Vernon Walters, asks for help. Contreras and others come. CIA teams come and offer training in what? Do we know?
Well, we don't exactly know what the training was. We have one agent, Chilean agent, who gave a deposition about the Chilean DINA operations and described how the CIA people came in early July of 1976, and that there was a whole school that was held out in the Callejon de Maipo, just outside of Santiago, a beautiful countryside outside of Santiago, 40 minutes or so, half an hour outside of Santiago, that a bunch of people attended on a daily basis. I would guess that this was focused on intelligence gathering and spying. And I don't particularly imagine that it was focused on torture and assassination,
Right.
because the Chileans and the Latin American militaries had already proven themselves to be perfectly proficient in torture and assassination, not international assassination, but internal assassination. So, and we know from the declassified documents of the meetings with Manuel Contreras in Washington with the CIA itself, that the CIA basically said to him, look, we will help with your intelligence capacity and building and organizations, but we won't, we're not going to help with repression. Now, there's a very fine line, if any line at all.
There's some hair splitting, yeah.
Yeah, because obviously the intelligence gathering capacity was the first major step in the repression. And that's what was actually what was being built at the beginning, and then expanded into an international assassination program as well. The U.S. role was complicated. Obviously, Nixon and Kissinger supported the eradication of the left in Latin America, but they didn't want it to happen in an embarrassing way for them. And they wanted to, they started down this road, and then almost immediately, the American people and the American Congress, and WOLA is the leading representative of this, the very existence of WOLA, which was created as an advocacy organization after the coup in Chile by people who had been in Chile, the Reverend Joseph Eldridge and others, to push back up against U.S. support for repression and the U.S. support for anti-democratic forces in countries like Chile. And so here we were with Nixon and Kissinger giving solace and support, financing, credits, you name it, loans, political cover to the Pinochets of the world at a very time in the mid-1970s when the American public was basically saying, not in our name, and of course being led by WOLA as an advocacy group. And so Kissinger faced for the first time this whole issue of human rights and as a criteria in U.S. foreign policy. And Chile and Uruguay and Argentina, they were the central countries that were receiving the worst attention. So you have to remember the context. Condor starts in late 1975, right after the collapse of Saigon in Vietnam, uproar over Vietnam, and right as human rights is becoming a big issue. And this is even more important, after the scandal of the CIA going around the world assassinating people breaks.
This was the Church Commission?
Yes, the Church Committee gets created in early 1975. The assassination scandal, the revelations that the CIA had tried to assassinate Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba and Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and Rene Schneider, the head of the Chilean armed forces in Chile, which arguably is the case where the CIA was most involved and most successful in a sense. They obviously were extremely involved in trying to assassinate Fidel Castro, but never managed to do so. But anyway, this was a big scandal. So then what happens? The CIA starts to obtain intelligence from various members of Operation Condor that this international assassination program is underway called Teseo. And the CIA starts to actually generate many, many intelligence reports on what this operation is all about, who's doing it, what the missions are, et cetera. And back in Washington, as Congress is investigating the CIA's role in these other assassinations, and the Church Committee report is about to come out, you've got senior CIA officials writing numerous memos to their superiors and trying to bring this to the attention of Henry Kissinger that this is just a bad idea. This is going to blow back on the CIA. The CIA is going to be accused of doing this, and because they do know about it, they do know that it's happening. And so now that they know that it's happening, what actions are they going to take? And actually, the CIA did some unexpected things. They actually sent their own people to France, and basically told French intelligence that there was a Teseo Condor team coming, and that they were targeting this person and that person. And the CIA wanted to give France a heads up about this, precisely so they wouldn't be blamed after the fact.
Great.
About
Avoid the embarrassment. Yeah.
for that. And actually that mission, because of what the CIA did, was thwarted. It did. And, that gives you a sense of the politics of the day. The CIA was fine with repression inside the borders of these countries. They were willing to support intelligence sharing. But as Harry Schlaudeman, the Assistant Secretary for Latin America, said in his very first report to Henry Kissinger about Operation Condor, this assassination component is bad for us. The Latin American generals, quote unquote, Schlaudeman reports to Kissinger, are seen as our guys. It cannot be good for us. And so they pushed Kissinger to write a démarche, to authorize a démarche to Pinochet, Videla in Argentina, and the junta in Uruguay, basically saying, look, we'll support you in all sorts of other things, but the assassination program is just bad for you and bad for us. So we're warning you right now, you shouldn't do that. And the démarche never got delivered, incredibly. It was sent.
This is all the summer of 76.
This is all in the late
before the
summer of
liberation.
76, at the end of August, 1976. I mean, two things happened. One, the ambassador in Uruguay, the U.S. ambassador, writes back to Schlaudeman and says, if I go in and tell the junta that we know where they're trying to assassinate people, my life will be in danger. And why the hell don't you just call in the ambassador from Uruguay and tell him yourself? Because you're in a much more secure situation than I am. And then the ambassador from Chile, the U.S. ambassador in Chile, writes back to Schlaudeman and says, if I deliver this démarche to Pinochet, as you've asked me to, he'll be insulted. He will be insulted and offended that we're accusing him of assassination, even though Pinochet had already assassinated people in September of 74 and September of 75. And so there was a track record of him doing this abroad already. So our ambassador says, so I don't want to deliver to him. Why don't you have the station chief deliver this to Manuel Contreras? And eventually they do, but it gets delivered after the Letelier assassination, rather than before the Letelier assassination. I swear to God, and this is most incredible, this resistance, pushback from these two ambassadors leads Schlaudeman to write to Kissinger and say, look, we're getting pushback from two of the three ambassadors. What do you want to do? Should we call it off, or should we reiterate to them that they have to deliver the démarche? I think we need to deliver it because this is a bad thing for us. And Kissinger, who's abroad on a diplomatic trip, writes back and he says, no, we haven't heard any intelligence about Condor operations, and so I want to rescind the démarche.
Wow.
And that cable comes in on September 16th, 1976. And then Schlaudeman sends out the message to rescind the démarche to his three ambassadors on September 20th. One day before a bomb goes off under the car of Orlando Letelier in downtown Washington. If they had just delivered the démarche on late August or early September, as it had all been put in motion to do, perhaps Pinochet would have been spooked and Contreras would have been spooked, and they would have called the Letelier mission off. But they dilly-dallied and delayed, and Kissinger rescinded, and the démarche never got delivered, and the most famous and infamous of Condor operations took place on the streets of Washington.
Right, at Sheridan Circle, right where Massachusetts Avenue meets 23rd Street and Embassy Row. Is it accurate to say that was the worst foreign terrorist incident in Washington, D.C. until September 11th?
It is absolutely accurate to say that.
Wow.
A car bombing placed by agents of a friendly state in the heart of Washington, D.C., killing two civilians, one of them a 26-year-old, a U.S. young woman working in DuPont Circle, almost killing her husband, who was in the car also. Michael Moffitt. So, it was just a heinous crime. It changed the contours of U.S. policy over the years towards Pinochet. And in fact, about 11 years later, Secretary of State George Shultz used the Letelier assassination and CIA intelligence that concluded that Pinochet had personally given the order for this act of international terrorism. Secretary Shultz used this to convince Ronald Reagan to abandon the Pinochet regime and move to supporting the return of civilian governance in Chile.
That's interesting. Before we get from here to there, I mean, this happens in about a month and a half before Jimmy Carter wins the 1976 election. You have an administration that is talking the talk a lot more on human rights and integrates it more into its policies. What changed at all with Carter over the next 4 years?
Well, I'd like to say that a lot changed, and I'd like to say that nothing changed.
Uh-huh.
Carter was an extremely decent person, unlike Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. He actually cared about human life and the sanctity of human rights, and he believed the United States should stand for something, whereas Nixon and Kissinger, somewhat of a feeble echo of today, believed the United States should exercise its power in any way that it could, given the international order, to control Latin America and take advantage and be the superpower of the Cold War. So Carter was different, and he did push for a human rights policy, but I have to say the bureaucracy did not really accept his position. The State Department, the FBI, the CIA, they all were so wedded to protecting their sources and working with their sources, which included all these vicious military regime personnel in the Southern Cone, that they just did not want to start reporting on human rights. And they certainly didn't want to use their liaison relationships with the DINA and others to press for better human rights. And so it got a lot of resistance, and there wasn't a lot of movement in a way. We did have the wonderful hero, Pat Darien, who became the first Assistant Secretary for Human Rights in the State Department. And she fought this ongoing battle with the other agencies and her own government to push forward this very issue. She took a trip to Argentina. She went to Chile. She reported on the atrocities that were taking place there. She pushed for sanctions. Carter inherited the Letelier assassination, and then his whole bureaucracy resisted actually penalizing the Chileans for having done this. And the sanctions that he eventually leveled 2 years later, when the FBI discovered that, in fact, hard evidence that DINA had done this, that this had been a Chilean operation, that this wasn't leftists that had planted this bomb, that the Chilean secret police had sent the special team and planted the bomb. And, the sanctions are extremely feeble. They came in 1979, if I recall. I actually wrote about them in the New York Times, the very first op-ed piece I ever published.
Wow.
As a young person in Washington. I could have been working for WOLA, but instead I was working for the Institute for Policy Studies, where Orlando Letelier and Ronni Moffitt, who were killed, had worked.
But we should just stop and just give a lot of credit to the Institute for Policy Studies, where they worked, and who have really, I fear that without IPS, that the Letelier-Moffitt attack would have been memory hold to some extent it has, but they have given an annual human rights award in the name of the victims of that attack for 50 years now.
And held a ceremony at Sheridan Circle where they were killed every year. For many years, my beautiful late wife, Ileana Lovelock, organized that ceremony and the dinner, the awards dinner in the 1980s. And after we came to the Institute for Policy Studies together, she was an executive assistant to Isabel Letelier. I worked with Saul Landau for many years and John Dingus on the case. So in any event, yes, that was the role of the United States. Carter certainly adopted a different position, but when push came to shove, his response and his administration's response to what Pinochet had done was demonstrably weak and sabotaged by the bureaucracies who, in the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, that really didn't want to change its relationships with the Southern Cone military police. With I should say that the exception of the FBI, there were a team of FBI agents who investigated the Letelier assassination. They were unbelievably courageous, unbelievably sharp, They broke the case. They managed to get the man who created the bomb and placed the bomb, Michael Townley, into U.S. custody. They deserved awards, and in fact, the Institute for Policy Studies at some point along the way actually gave them
Wow.
Robert Scherer and Carter Cornick the Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Award for their work.
Wow. That's good to know that there were some officials doing their proper job, but I'm trying to avoid using the word deep state, but it is remarkable how they are the exception here and how they push back even against a president who at least is making noise about reform so effectively. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan takes over in 1980-81. And this is when those of us who come from, born in the early 1970s are more aware of what U.S. policy toward Latin America looks like. But I have memories of friendly meetings with Augusto Pinochet and of course, with everything that was going on in Central America with support for dictatorships and death squad regimes there and the Contras. Is there nuance to the Reagan story? Because Reagan obviously was also president when the plebiscite is getting organized and things like that, or did they really just continue in the line of the deep staters who resisted Carter the whole time?
Well, Ronald Reagan was, a two-term president.
Mm.
We all worked, all of us, WOLA, the Institute for Policy Studies, so many other organizations in Washington to oppose Reagan's counterinsurgency operations in Central America, the incredible support that the Reagan administration gave for tortures and murders and mass murderers, massacres, etc.
Mm.
And in the first years, 1981 through 1984 of the Reagan term, actually Reagan counted on Pinochet as an ally to support the counterinsurgency operations in El Salvador in particular, and to some degree to help the Contras. It was a secret mission as part of the Iran-Contra scandal. It was revealed as part of the Iran-Contra scandal of Chileans being used to acquire what were called British blowpipe missiles. These are shoulder-held
Like surface to
missile
air
launcher that the Contras could use against the helicopters, the Soviet helicopters that the Sandinista government had acquired to fight the Contra War. And the issue for the United States, for Reagan and his people, was how can we get these weapons into the Contras' hands quickly? And the answer was, let's just go to our allies who already have these weapons. But there's a whole legal system which prevents an export of blowpipe missiles from Britain to Chile to then be transferred to other places, because the British don't want to be supporting the Contras. That's not their policy. Mm-hmm. So they have what's called an end user clause in these military technology transfers. And so they had to be done secretly, covertly. And that was what Oliver North was attempting to do to help the Contras. So for the first 4 years, Pinochet was a big ally in the wars in Central America. But then what happened? The middle class started to rise up against Pinochet. The economy, his free market economy, faltered. His repression was overwhelming. And it became clear that he wanted to be dictator for life rather than ever yield to the return to civilian rule. And one of the things that happened is the left started to become more militant in Chile, including in 1986, an assassination attempt against Pinochet.
Oh, wow.
And this failed, and all the people involved in it were executed by the Chilean military, secret police. But the impact in Washington was substantial. It was that now Pinochet was weak and vulnerable. He was going to get overthrown by the left, and all the efforts that had been made through him being in power to eradicate the left were going to fail. The only way to save the situation was to have it transfer back to civilian rule, even conservative civilian rule. And so the whole movement inside the Reagan administration started in late 1984, 85, 86. It picked up momentum when Pinochet and his people murdered a young U.S. resident named Rodrigo Rojas. You may remember that case. Teenager whose mother had been a torture victim and brought her two young sons to Washington after the coup, and he had grown up here. I used to babysit him. A beautiful young man. He hung out at the Institute for Policy Studies, but when he was 18, 19, he decided he needed to go back to Chile and kind of join the street protests. And he was only a few weeks back when he was in a protest, and he and another girl were taken by the military, had gasoline poured on them, set on fire, and dumped into a ditch and left to burn to death. And because he was a U.S. resident, this case went all the way up to Reagan. We have the memos that went to him. Pinochet tried to orchestrate a whole cover-up here, but eventually that was exposed. So many people had seen the military seize them and set them on fire and leave them. Rodrigo survived for like 4 days, and the young woman he was with, she actually did survive and went into exile in Canada. But they told the story, and so that built more momentum, I have to say, for pushing Pinochet out. And Schultz used the Letelier assassination and Operation Condor and Pinochet's personal role in ordering an act of international terrorism in Washington as a strong argument with Reagan to abandon U.S. support for Pinochet. And at one point, we have the minutes of a National Security Council meeting from November of 1986, where the topic of the meeting is Chile and Pinochet. And Reagan is basically mumbling about how he just had so much respect for Pinochet because he privatized Social Security and he implemented free market economics. And it just seemed like a shame that we should push him out. Why not, Reagan says, why not invite him to a state visit to Washington so that I can pat him on the back and say, General, you did a great service to the West, but now it's time to go. I will support you in your retirement. And Secretary Schultz, in this declassified minutes of this meeting, says to the President of the United States, Mr. President, this man is a monster. He has blood on his hands. No way are you inviting him for a state visit to Washington.
I didn't know that. Wow. And this is 1986. This is, the Berlin Wall is still up. The Daniel Ortega is still there. If you want to be a fire-breathing Cold Warrior, you still can do that. But there was some stepping down from that because the Chilean regime had gotten that bad, or they finally realized it was that bad. That's a fascinating story. We've been going for a while, and I'd like to hear, in the time we have, your reflections about relevance of this for today. And maybe the bridge to that is explaining to people how you and other researchers uncovered a lot of this information about the deliberations in the United States, about what we know about what these secretive institutions were doing in the region. Is it just filing FOIA requests, or was there a lot more involved here?
No, there's much, much more involved. There were a lot of FOIA requests filed. For example, my little anecdote to you about the pushback from the ambassadors in Uruguay and Chile about the démarche for Condor, particularly the Uruguayan part of that came through a Freedom of Information Act request that I made. But Chile, became the subject of many investigations, not just the Church Committee investigation, which shed a lot of light on the CIA role in assassinating the Chilean commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but also the whole effort to overthrow Allende and support Pinochet. That all came from documents that the Church Committee reviewed. They didn't release the documents, but they reviewed them. We then knew that those documents existed. We pushed for them. Because of the Letelier assassination, the legal side of that case generated massive amounts of material on Operation Condor. And then when Pinochet was arrested in England, many of us, Wola was involved in this.
1998.
We went up to the Clinton White House and we basically said, you should declassify all the documents. Why do you want to protect Kissinger and Nixon and others? You should declassify the documents so Spain has evidence to prosecute Pinochet. And, there were some very good people from our community in the Clinton administration, among them Mort Halperin. John Shattuck was Assistant Secretary of Human Rights. There were others, and they basically argued to President Clinton that there was a good idea to have a special declassification, and he ordered a special declassification, and 23,000 documents that we'd never seen before were released, a number of them on Operation Condor. And then there was a second huge declassification on Argentina many years later that started with Obama and ended with Trump, and that revealed for the first time Operation Teseo, which had remained a secret for all those years. Those documents came out in 2018, and Teseo was created in June of 1976. And it took that long. Those secrets were held for that long, which is an abomination, since, those secrets are on pieces of paper that were created with the American taxpayer's dollar.
And there's no national security justification for not knowing about Teseo.
Intelligence operations, and just cover up.
Methods. Yeah.
And the fact that it took us years to get the CIA conclusions that Pinochet had masterminded an act of international terrorism in Washington, D.C. We got that document on the 40th anniversary of the Letelier assassination 10 years ago.
2006.
And, if that document had been leaked or just used for legal purposes back at the time, we could have prosecuted Pinochet while he was still dictator in the 70s for an act of international terrorism. And instead, it was deep sixed. It was deep sixed by the CIA and never really shared, I think, with higher ups in the Carter administration. And frankly, it wasn't clear that any of them had the real spine to push forward on that very issue of Pinochet's personal responsibility. But I do want to say, as the 50th anniversary arrives of the Letelier-Moffitt assassination, that holding Pinochet responsible remains, I think, critical to the history. It's critical to what's going on politically in Chile, where there's a whole wave of denialism about who Pinochet really was. And I think it's going on around the world, where other leaders who want to be dictators simply feel that they can get away with targeted assassination. Daniel Ortega is sending his assassins out around Central America to murder civilian opponents of his regime in cold blood. One of the crimes of Nicolas Maduro that has not been, I think, targeted, addressed in his whole kidnapping and arrest is sending a team of assassins to Chile just a few years ago to kill a mid-level military officer who'd been involved in a coup plot against Maduro. And this guy was dragged from his house in the middle of the night in front of his whole family and found buried under a slab of cement 5 days later in downtown Santiago, Chile. And this was obviously a Letelier-style assassination emanating from Venezuela. So you have what you would call transnational assassination efforts going on in this day and age that are reminiscent of Condor, although they're not done in a collaborative way. They're done by individual states. And then you have the United States, I have to say. The Trump administration engaged in targeted assassination of completely innocent people, essentially, which has amounted to serial assassination on the high seas, murdering alleged, drug crews on these small boats without any evidence that they're guilty of anything, frankly. So this type of abuse continues on. Torture and collaboration became more prevalent in the post 9/11 world in the United States. Calling anybody a terrorist gives free license to the United States to kidnap, torture, and assassinate them. You just have this type of freewheeling approach to the sanctity of human rights and state-sponsored repression that you didn't have before. Condor was an unusual, unique, and sinister effort. And that kind of effort is far more common now, the kind of collaborative effort on abusing human rights, whether it's detention centers in El Salvador that the United States is bribing Bukele to have, or other countries, the Congo, elsewhere, or it's murdering people on the high seas without any trial, being judge, jury, and executioner of dozens, almost 200 people at this point.
187 as of this recording.
Yeah, you have a very different ambience when it comes to the meaning of human rights. And I just think that the drama and the impact of Condor for what it was at the time is what needs to be remembered as we once again try and build a human rights movement to protect the values of our own country and the sanctity of life abroad.
And finally, given this current context, you mentioned the boat strike killings. There's been some other really alarming episodes happening both on land and in the sea, in and around Ecuador, Venezuela. Lord knows what we're doing with oil and with mining and organized crime there with the Secot in El Salvador. There's a lot we need information about right now. And the kind of work that you did uncovering Condor and support for the Chilean regime and elsewhere, that seemed to depend on a lot of litigation, getting the Letelier case and getting information out. Yes, FOIAs. Yes, direct work with the White House. When you had a White House, you could work with Congress. When you had a Congress that actually had a majority that could compel the release of documents and other information and do investigations. What tools are available to today's advocates and historians to uncover what's happening now I would say now, and also assuming there's some change in Congress in November, what would be a promising way to get at some of what's happening now?
I mean, you have, I think, very important work by the press that should be
Yes.
credited. You have congressional officials trying to obtain information about this. They will certainly have more force if the Congress changes after November, but that won't stop the Trump administration, I think, from covering up the documentation that's needed. But, I think we just have to remember to conclude that Pinochet and his ilk intended Condor and Operation Teseo to remain secret forever. And we did eventually find out about it. And in many ways, there was accountability for those officials that engaged in those atrocities. Contreras spent most of the rest of his life in jail. Pinochet was arrested in London. He was arrested several times back in Chile. He sat in his wheelchair while his wife was carted off by police. There was a degree of accountability, at least historically, for him and some justice for his DINA officials who committed these crimes. And I should just say, I do believe and I do hope that the tenacious efforts on human rights will lead to those who are committing human rights atrocities every day as we speak, to eventually be held accountable for what are human rights atrocities and crimes.
I hold that hope also and realize that we and those younger than us have a lot of work to do coming up.
Thank you for letting us talk about this.
Oh, I'm so glad we had the opportunity. Thank you, Peter, and thanks for all of the work you've done and continue to do.
All right.
For now.
Keep up the good work. Keep up the effort.
Many thanks to Peter Kornbluh for giving us some time, giving us such a thorough and clear review of Operation Condor, what it was, and what we can learn today, right now, from this decades-long effort to honor the victims, to uncover what happened, and to hold as many people as possible accountable. I learned a lot. I hope that you did too. Please do stay tuned. We'll keep the podcast episodes coming. And as I mentioned at the beginning, as with all that WOLA does and produces, we depend on donations to make these episodes happen. If you are a supporter, thank you for making this work possible. If you're not, just remember that you could be very easily. But either way, thank you for listening. Stay well, and goodbye for now.